Saint Teresa of Avila was persecuted for being traditional, for wishing to return to the true and centuries-old tradition of the Carmelites. As incredible as it may seem, this persecution was promoted by the clergy itself. In fact, the life of Saint Teresa has a lot of lessons for us, things that we can learn from her that can be applied in our days. Let me explain. Saint Teresa of Jesus, a 16th century Spanish nun, led a frivolous life for many, many years. Her prayers were not fervent, and neither was her conduct very holy. Though she did have moments of piety, as a rule, she spent her days in a very trivial manner. Instead of passing her days in prayer and contemplation, she used to spend her time in the parlor, constantly talking to visitors. Of course, she was not the only nun to do this. In fact, this was the rule rather than the exception in her lax convent. But the fact that everyone else committed the same mistake did not make it less injurious to God. We know for a fact that her soul was crawling with sins. Maybe not mortal sins, but nevertheless offenses against God. In fact, she continued this wrong path in spite of repeated warnings by our Lord. Once, as she was talking with someone in the convent parlor, she suddenly saw a horrible toad-like creature crawling rapidly towards her. On another occasion, Jesus himself appeared to her and reproached her with his gaze. But, unfortunately, her heart was hardened by her many, many faults, and she continued her frivolous lifestyle. But, after assisting her own father at his deathbed, she received the grace of conversion. Her father was a very virtuous man. Who knows if his intercession before God after his death was not what merited this undeserved grace for Teresa. But anyway, the fact is she did convert. And then she lived happily ever after, the end. Well, not really. You see, Jesus did not want her to merely be a saint in her own cell, in prayer and contemplation. He desired that she convert her whole order, the Carmelites. Now, those people who did not mind her when she was not a faithful nun, they were not happy at her conversion. And above all, they could not bear it when she started doing apostle with others and started converting others. Moreover, she desired to reform the whole Carmelite order. The Carmelite order had strayed away from many of its own traditions in that day and time. In fact, they had adopted a new mitigated rule. Now this new rule was much easier to follow. But what was worse, not even this easier rule was being followed seriously. Saint Teresa desired to found convents for those who desired to go back to the traditional Carmelite rule, with all its austerities, with all its sufferings, and with all the sanctity that was inherent to this rule. Of course, no sooner had she started her work that all sorts of accusations, calumnies, and persecutions were thrown at her. In fact, she was persecuted not just by the clergy, but even by the civil powers, who were instigated by the religious, as incredible as it may seem. However, with the help of grace, she remained faithful to her vocation until her death. And before she died, in spite of all the sufferings, in spite of everything that she had to go through, in a miraculous way, God had guaranteed that the powers of darkness would not prevail against her and against her reform. She founded the Discalced Carmelites, that is, the branch of Carmelites, who had desired to go back to the more austere rule. Besides this, she had even helped other Carmelites who followed the mitigated rule to be truly faithful to their rule. Even in our days, we have Carmelites who are faithful to the true and ancient spirit of their founder, the prophet St. Elias. And this is because of St. Teresa. Now, what does this have to do with our daily life? A lot. We can learn 2 lessons from her story. The first one, we know that if we do good, we will be persecuted. It is a mere illusion for us to imagine that we can go about doing good to others, doing apostolate, trying to help others, and that people will applaud us. On the contrary, the more good that we do, the more we will be persecuted. In fact, Saint Teresa did not attack anybody. She did not desire to close the old convents. No, she just desired to form new convents for herself and others who wished to follow her example. And yet, this was not granted to her without a lot of suffering. Now, this hatred that the evil has towards the good has existed all throughout history. In fact, we can see the first case of this in the life of Cain and Abel. What did Abel do to be hated by his brother Cain? Nothing. He was just faithful to God. He just did what he was supposed to do. But Cain could not bear to see someone who was faithful. The Bible is full of cases of men who led faithful lives, who proclaimed the truth, and yet were killed even if they did no harm to anyone. This is a part of our life. It is a part of our Christian vocation to be persecuted. Because Jesus Christ, who was goodness incarnate, who was God incarnate, who was perfect, he himself was persecuted unto death. Now, the second lesson that we can learn from St. Teresa's life is that the persecution is not a sign that things are going wrong. Suffering is not a sign that we are going to lose the battle. On the contrary, the battles that we fight on God's side are full of sufferings, full of instances where it seems that everything is lost. In these moments, we should remember the words of St. Teresa. Nothing should disturb you. Nothing should frighten you. Everything is passing. God does not change. Patience achieves everything. He who has God lacks nothing. God alone is enough. However, we should remember that external and direct persecution is just one of the ways in which God may visit our souls. Maybe the suffering that you are going through in your life today is not the same that St. Teresa suffered. But no matter who you are and how you suffer, there is one thing that all of us goes through: temptations. And even St. Teresa was not free from temptations. Did you know that St. Teresa almost went to hell because of one mistake that she was committing in her spiritual life? In next week's video, I will tell you what that mistake was and how we can avoid falling into the same trap in our lives. I hope to see you in the next video. And please remember to pray to St. Teresa for you, your family, and the heralds of the gospel. Salve Maria.